Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Sutta session here at Empty Cloud Monastery. So welcome to everyone who's checked in so far this morning. So hello to Sarah, Elaine, Gita Nyana, Robin, Kauser friend, Kyle, and Michael. Good to see all of you. So as usual, I'll read through, and Liz and Chittapala, hello to the two of you as well. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations, and then I'll answer questions at the end. So please enter questions at any time so that we're sure to get through all of them at the end. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So today we'll be looking at a very important discourse, the contents of which are found in several different suttas. This particular one is the shortest, most condensed form of it, with the segment, the critical segment presented in isolation. So this is what's translated here as the four great criteria. So this is from the Mahapadesa Sutta in Guttara Nikaya 4.180. You'll commonly see this translated as the four great standards or the four great references. And those are also perfectly fine renditions of this word. So this sutta is particularly important for those who are exposed to a wide range of different teachers from different traditions and different styles and methods. And it can all seem quite puzzling, like what is the Dhamma? Sometimes different teachers can give seemingly contrary messages. So this sutta gives us a way of understanding, a way of how to relate to a variety or range of different teachings and instructions. So I'll go ahead and start reading through the sutta. On one occasion, the fortunate one was living at Boga town at the Ananda shrine. For reference, by the way, the word Boga means wealth. So Boga town, the wealthy town. Minor little point of amusement. Often the place names in suttas are left untranslated, but most of them are real Pali words with real meanings, and the literal meanings are often quite amusing. Anyway, so there the fortunate one addressed the monks. Monks! Venerable sir, those monks replied to the fortunate one. The fortunate one said this. Monks, I will teach you the four great criteria. Listen to this and carefully pay attention. I will speak. Yes, Bhante, those monks replied to the fortunate one. The fortunate one said this. Monks, what are the four great criteria? Monks, if a monk says this, Venerable, in the presence of the fortunate one, this is what I heard and received. This is the Dhamma, this is the Vinaya, this is the teacher's instructions. You should neither accept nor reject that monk's statement. Without either accepting or rejecting it, you should carefully take up those words and phrases and compare them to the suttas and the Vinaya. When you are comparing them with the suttas and the Vinaya, if they do not accord with the suttas and Vinaya, then you should form this conclusion. Certainly, this is not the speech of the fortunate one, the worthy one, the fully self-awakened one. It was wrongly held by that monk. Therefore, monks, you should discard it. So this is the first case. So somebody says that they've learned something from the Buddha, which given that the Buddha passed away a long time ago, this is already a suspect statement. But you might hear something from a deva, perhaps. So there are devas alive now who were alive at the time of the Buddha and who received instructions from the Buddha. So those are the only beings I can think of who might say that they heard something directly from the Buddha. Another possibility would be somebody who has telepathic contact with the Buddha in another universe. That's also theoretically possible. And both of these scenarios, so both visions of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in other worlds, and also devas delivering instructions that they said they received from Shakyamuni Buddha. These are both some of the background stories for the origin of some of the later Buddhist scriptures. So particularly in the Mahayana and Vajrayana canon, there are a number of texts which are said to have been received and memorized by devas, and then later recited to humans. And this is not implausible, given that the Buddha spent a great deal of time teaching devas, giving instructions to devas, and also his disciples, particularly Venerable Mahamoggallana, is also recorded as giving teachings to devas. So it's actually quite plausible that there were Dhamma teachings which were remembered by devas but forgotten by humans, and later were again taught by devas humans, so that they could be remembered again, recorded again. That's not implausible. As for receiving instructions from Buddhas in other universes, again, not implausible, possible. Or instructions from bodhisattvas, again, quite possible. But in all these cases, the Buddha gives a simple way of handling it. He says, first off, when someone's telling you what they think is the Dhamma, don't automatically accept it and don't automatically reject it. Rather, he says, carefully take up those words and phrases. So I particularly like that he emphasizes carefully. So pay attention, because you might be hearing something valuable. You might be hearing something worthwhile. You might be hearing something valid. So I know a number of monks who, if you start talking to them about some particular Dhamma teaching, and you just happen to mention the M word is Mahayana. If you happen to mention the M word, then they just immediately shut down. They just immediately reject whatever you're saying. They're just like, no, that's definitely not true. But this is quite problematic. The Buddha clearly says that we shouldn't automatically reject something before we've had a chance to compare its contents to the suttas and the Vinaya. And also, we have the opposite problem, where someone will receive a teaching from a teacher and just automatically accept it, whether because of faith in that particular teacher or faith in the tradition that teacher is from, or just whatever reason one might have for automatically accepting something. Then one just says, oh, well, okay, I guess that's the Dhamma. But that's also quite dangerous. So the danger of automatically rejecting is that we might be throwing out something valuable, which is in fact true Dhamma, and we're discarding it simply because of prejudice. So that's clearly not of benefit. But automatically accepting is also quite dangerous, because if someone's teaching you something that's not Dhamma, and we accept it unthinkingly, then we can fall into wrong view. We can fall into a distorted misbelief about reality, which can be extremely obstructive to progress on the path. So instead, what the Buddha says is that we should, again, carefully take up those words and phrases. So really make an effort to understand the teaching that's being presented, and then compare it back to the suttas and the Vinaya. So this depends upon one knowing what's in the suttas, by the way. So if you don't know what's in the suttas, then these criteria are not particularly useful for you. So number one, read the suttas, all of them. I say this over and over and over again, but very few people take me up on this piece of advice. But it's really important. If you want to understand the Dhamma, read the suttas, all of them, cover to cover. I know lots of people have a very long book list of very important books that they really want to read about this and that. And that's all fine. You can still have your really long book list of all kinds of different things to read. The suttas are at the top of that list. Until you've read through all of them at least once, it's at the top of the list. Now, this is the single most important thing you'll read in your life. Similarly, it mentions the Vinaya. So this is particularly relevant to monastics. So the Vinaya is the code of conduct for Buddhist monks. This also comes up because every now and then someone will come and say, well, the Vinaya says such and such, monks are supposed to behave in this way or that way. And we should be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I'll look into it. And then we should look into it. We should study the Vinaya and see if they're correct or not. Over the years that I've been a monk, I've had innumerable times when someone came and told me, oh, monks aren't supposed to do that. Monks should be doing that instead. And I'm like, oh, okay, thank you. And then I look it up in the Vinaya and they're completely wrong. Or they've got a distorted perspective on the Vinaya, or they have only a fragment of necessary information. With the Vinaya, this becomes actually quite relevant because the Vinaya is a very complex document. It's a very complex set of rules and procedures covering thousands of pages, thousands of rules, which all interlock and relate to each other in a quite complicated way. And they're full of exceptions and variations and permutations, which without a great deal of study, it's quite difficult to have a thorough understanding of the Vinaya. But often over the years, I've encountered people who once upon a time, they picked up a Vinaya book and read it for 10 minutes, and then they think that then they're an expert and they can go around telling other monks what to do. Or lay people telling monks what to do, which is even more amusing. Again, this is kind of like if I go and I pick up a book on quantum physics and I read it for 10 minutes, and then I go to a professional physicist and start lecturing them about quantum mechanics. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, but if we're on the receiving end of that, then once again, we should always start with the possibility that the person may be saying something valid. They may be saying something useful. So to carefully take up what they're saying and then bring it back to the Vinaya and look and see, does this line up with what's actually in the Vinaya? So again, that's more, the Vinaya thing is more for monks. But the suttas is relevant to everyone, whether you're a layperson or a monk. So always giving the possibility that what the person is saying may be true Dhamma. And then bring it back. If you already thoroughly know the suttas, then you can go by memory. If you don't thoroughly know the suttas, then it's time to thoroughly know the suttas, isn't it? You can also consult teachers. In fact, this is a good idea anyway. If you know monks who have a deep and thorough and broad knowledge of the suttas, then you can ask them. You can say, oh, somebody said this and this about the Dhamma. Is this true based on your understanding? And see what they say. And it's good to consult several different monks, not just one, because this will help get you a broader view of things. And even if you think you understand what's in the suttas, it's still important to go and discuss it with teachers from time to time. It's very easy to form a wrong view or a wrong understanding about the Dhamma without even realizing that's what it is. We think we know the Dhamma, but actually we're just reifying our own opinions. So checking in with teachers and saying like, well, this is what I think about karma. This is what I think about rebirth. This is what I think about meditation. What do you think? And if they're good teachers, they might say things like, well, maybe that's not the best way to look at it. And they'll give you another perspective. But we still bring it back to the suttas. So then the second case, the Buddha says, same opening scenario, a monk says, I heard this in the presence of the Buddha. Well, you should neither accept it nor reject it, but compare it to the suttas and the Vinaya. And in this case, it says, if they accord with the suttas and the Vinaya, then you should form this conclusion. Certainly, this is the speech of the fortunate one, the worthy one, the fully self-awakened one. It was correctly held by that monk. So this is the case where you receive some teaching and you compare it back to the scriptures, and it's like, oh, okay, this lines up pretty well. This is probably accurate. It's probably a genuine teaching. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the teaching is definitely a verbatim quote of the Buddha. That's not the point. The point is that it accords with the Dhamma as found in the suttas. The truth is, we don't even necessarily know if the suttas are verbatim quotes from the Buddha. I personally believe that the suttas are, much of what's contained in the suttas is very close to quotes from the Buddha. But it's clearly undergone a fair amount of linguistic homogenization over its first few hundred years, and actually even since then. It's clearly undergone a great deal of editing and collation. And there's clearly been some additions and subtractions. And there's almost certainly been some things that have been lost. So even if we're focusing on the Pali Canon, which Theravadins like to claim as the oldest and most reliable set of Buddhist scriptures, which is a questionable claim for the record. But even if we're looking at the Pali Canon, we can't necessarily say that these are definitely a perfect record of verbatim quotes from the Buddha. But that's beside the point. It doesn't matter. What matters is to discern the flavor of the Dhamma. And the flavor of the Dhamma is clearly present in the suttas. So you discern the flavor of the Dhamma, and then when something doesn't quite match that flavor, then you know it's not the Dhamma, or you know that it's a little bit off. And in going through the suttas, we actually find that there's a small percentage of suttas which don't quite match the flavor of the Dhamma. A clear example of this is the Bakula Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya. The Bakula Sutta is clearly a spurious text which was added later, without question. And how do we know this? We know this because it contradicts what's found in 99% of the suttas. It's not giving a different angle on some teaching, it's giving a completely different teaching. So clearly there's something wrong there. Also, things like the statement that we find a couple places in the suttas stating that women cannot be Buddhas. Again, this radically contradicts what we find all throughout the suttas, stating that gender has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with one's spiritual capacities. So when we find an isolated incident somewhere in the suttas where it says otherwise, we can single that out and saying like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't accord with the suttas. It doesn't accord with the rest of the suttas. Therefore, this is probably not the Buddha's instructions. So this method of examination also applies to the suttas themselves. But this also goes the other way. So we also need to be careful not to project our own opinions onto the suttas. For example, I'm aware of one contemporary lay teacher who has formed the belief that rebirth is completely false. There's no such thing as rebirth. But this particular teacher also claims to rely on the suttas as their authority. So the approach this teacher takes then is to go through the suttas and eliminate every reference to rebirth, which is quite a challenge because the Buddha talked about rebirth all the time. It's so completely interwoven with the suttas that you can't pull it out without eviscerating the entire Pali Canon. So that's quite a destructive approach, as if we start trying to rewrite the entire collection of scriptures based on our own opinions. That's not going to get us anywhere. Instead, we can go with the beginning point of assuming that most of the suttas are pretty accurate, and that there's a small amount of distortion or corruption mixed in, but that if we read through all the suttas, then we'll discern the flavor of the Dhamma and we'll be able to recognize what's not in harmony with the rest. And then this also then applies to reading Mahayana sutras. The Mahayana sutras tend to be a bit more difficult because they tend to be a lot more metaphorical. So the Pali Canon, for the most part, is written in a very literal, straightforward way. It's written in the contents are presented very much as just bald, straightforward X, Y, Z, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's very straightforward. Whereas the Mahayana sutras tend to be more metaphorical and are more about illuminating a feeling around something or coaxing the mind into another perspective. So when reading the Mahayana sutras, again, it's looking at the underlying message, trying to discern what message is being brought forward by the sutra, and if that's in line with the Dhamma. And generally speaking, you'll find the answer is yes. But as with the Pali Suttas, you'll also find some corruptions and interpolations and questionable additions. And in some cases, the Mahayana Sutras also contradict each other. So an example of this is that the older Pure Land Sutras are presenting it as the Pure Land being something which is for both men and women. But then in the Lotus Sutra, which is hundreds of years later, then suddenly out of the blue, it claims that the Pure Land is only for men. And it's like, well, where did that come from? So similarly, we can reasonably conclude that that's a distortion. It's somebody's gender bias getting added into a text hundreds of years later. So this, once again, is a matter of comparing things back to the Dhamma, always discerning things in line with Dhamma. So then the second of the four great criteria, the Buddha says, monks, if a monk says this, in that place a community lives which has elders and prominent people. From that community, this is what I heard and received. This is the Dhamma, this is the Vinaya, this is the teacher's instructions. So here also the Buddha gives the same criteria. So you compare it back to the Suttas and the Vinaya. So this is the case where someone's not saying they learned it directly from the Buddha, but rather they went to a monastery where there were a lot of very senior monks, well-known monks, highly respected monks, and they got some teachings from those monks. And here again, the Buddha is saying, don't just automatically accept or reject those teachings, but compare them back to the suttas. So this is a bit reminiscent of the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha is saying not to believe something just because it's said by a well-respected teacher, or just because it's traditional, but always to apply your own investigation. So in modern terms, we would call this appeal to authority. Well, Venerable so-and-so said it, therefore it must be true. And the Buddha says, well, no, not necessarily. It might be true, it might not be true. Compare it back to the suttas, see what's in there. Then the third criteria, similarly, it says, in that place, many elder monks live who have learned much, who carry the scriptural tradition, who hold the Dhamma, who hold the Vinaya, who hold the lists. In the presence of those elders, this is what I heard and received. This is the Dhamma, this is the Vinaya, this is the teacher's instructions. So again, a similar case where the person is basing the authority of their teachings based upon a group of well-learned monks, well-educated monks who they believe that those monks understand the suttas well. Well, I mean, that's actually a great starting point, just for the record. It's great to learn from senior, well-educated monks who are knowledgeable in the suttas. That's great, but it's not necessarily reliable. Every single person brings their own particular biases, prejudices, and distorted perspectives to whatever they're doing, to whatever they're reading, to whatever they're hearing, to whatever they're learning, and therefore to whatever they're teaching. So once again, even if very senior, respectable, educated monks tell us something, don't necessarily accept it on face value, but rather carefully investigate it and see if it's in line with the Dhamma. And then the fourth of the great criteria, this is the case where someone says, in that place an elder monk lives who has learned much, etc. So in this case, it's just one monk who gives a teaching, and the Buddha applies the same analysis. So in each of these four cases, the Buddha gives the same criteria. So it's called the four great criteria, but realistically, there's just one. There's one criterion. So regardless of what source one has for a Dhamma teaching, one should neither accept it nor reject it until one has compared it back to the suttas, compared it back to the scriptures, carefully examined what's in line with the Dhamma. And what's in line with the Dhamma we keep, and what's not in line with the Dhamma we question or discard. So this is the proper course of action to take. So these four great criteria are, once again, they're very important because these days there's a tremendous body of information which goes by the title Buddhism. And some of that information is from the Pali Suttas, some of it's from the Mahayana Sutras, some of it's from the Vajrayana Sutras, some of it's from ancient teachers, some of it from contemporary teachers. So in sifting through all this, the question is, what is the flavor of the true Dhamma? And the Buddha himself gives a very good way of discerning this. If it's in line with the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, and the three universal characteristics, then it's the true Dhamma. And this is what we see running through 99% of the Buddhist scriptures, regardless of tradition. We see these basic, universal, overarching principles of Dhamma. And then when we discern something that's out of harmony with these overarching principles, then we can recognize it immediately. We know it for what it is, and we can set it aside as not being the true Dhamma. So these are the four great criteria. At this time, I think we can go ahead and switch to questions. I see there's a few questions already. So I'll go ahead and start reading through these questions. Let's see, Michael says, may we say that upon hearing a friend or teacher, monastic or not, we measure their words against the Dhamma as recorded in the canon, and if it jives, we can accept and embrace it? Yeah. Just keeping in mind, once again, that there are a tiny fraction of suttas which are at odds with the rest of the suttas. So every now and then you will encounter someone who cherry picks from the suttas things taken out of context in order to validate a certain wrong view. Which, if you know the suttas, you'll recognize that immediately. But if you don't know the suttas, then someone will just be like, yeah, well, in the Bakula Sutta, it says X, Y, Z. And you'll look up the Bakula Sutta and you'll be like, oh, gosh, he's right. And in fact, you would be right. But if you read all the suttas, then you would know that the Bakula Sutta is not Dhamma. And therefore not to be accepted. And any quotation from the Bakula Sutta is to be discarded. So again, it's really indispensable to read the suttas. And once you've read the Pali Suttas, then you'll have a foundation for understanding the Mahayana Sutras. And therefore a foundation for understanding all the Buddhist traditions. And Michael says, also fake Buddha quotes. If they are accurate reflections of Dhamma, good to go. If not, off they go. The issue of their authenticity is secondary to their accuracy. What do you think of this? I think that's completely correct. The truth is we have absolutely no idea whatsoever what Buddha quotes are perfectly authentic, as I mentioned earlier. So the pursuit of perfectly authentic Buddha quotes is bound to fail. We just don't know. There were no recordings at the time of the Buddha. Nobody was making MP3s of the Buddha's Dhamma talks. They weren't streaming on YouTube Live. So we don't know. We don't know exactly what the Buddha said word for word. But we can discern the essence of his teachings. So yeah, I would say that the accuracy of a quote is more important than its authenticity. But I would also say that if somebody is providing a Buddha quote, then they'd better have a reference for it. I don't care whether it's a reference from the Pali Canon or the Chinese Canon or the Tibetan Canon, but there better be a reference for it, because there are, in fact, a lot of fake Buddha quotes out there. And it's fine to say cute spiritual things and even cute Buddhist things, but if you're going to claim it was said by the Buddha, you better have some backup for that statement. You better be able to give a scripture reference. How's our friend says, so can we fully trust all the sutras in the canon as being the authentic word of the Buddha, or more generally authentic Dhamma? He says, I asked too soon, this has been answered. Yeah, it's been answered. Aaron asks, what translation of the suttas do you recommend to read? I recommend reading the suttas in Pali. As a second option, you can read them in Chinese. As a distant third option, you can read them in English. If you do read them in English, well, in all humility, I like my own translations, but every translator says that, so that should come as no surprise. But after that, Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations are quite good, for the most part. Bhante Sujato's translations, which are freely available on Sutta Central, Bhante Sujato's translations are quite friendly and accessible, whereas Bhikkhu Bodhi's tend to be a bit more intellectual and scholarly. So in my opinion, Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations are a bit more accurate for the most part, whereas Bhante Sujato's are a bit more readable. Though Bhikkhu Bodhi also tends to translate based on the commentaries, which I don't like because the commentaries are often out of harmony with the suttas, whereas Bhante Sujato does not follow the commentaries most of the time. So those are the two main bodies of English translations which are currently available, and they both have their ups and downs. I do not recommend reading the old Polytext Society translations. So there were a bunch of translations which were produced starting in the late 1800s and going through to a few decades ago, till the 1950s or so. Those are all really, really bad. They're really inaccurate and out of date. I don't recommend reading those at all. Bhikkhu Bodhi or Bhante Sujato, those are the translators that I recommend, besides myself, of course. But I don't currently have a complete collection anywhere. I just have a few dozen selected suttas that I've translated. Michael asks, I wonder if the difference between the Theravada and the Mahayana Sutras might also reflect the difference between the way the Pali, Sanskrit, and Chinese languages operate. That also is an impact on things. So most of the Mahayana canon survives only in Chinese translation, though there's quite a volume of it that's available in Sanskrit. Much of it was preserved in Nepal. So most of the Sanskrit originals of the Mahayana Sutras were destroyed during a series of invasions of northern India, which happened about 1,000 years ago. There were some very grumpy anti-Buddhist invaders from the Middle East who came in and burned down most of the monasteries and killed most of the monks. So that's a quite unhappy incident in Buddhist history. And it's why we don't have most of the Sanskrit originals of the Mahayana Sutras. But much of it was preserved in Sanskrit in Nepal. Including some very important texts, the Vajracchedika Prajnaparamita Sutra, the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, the Astasahasraka Prajnaparamita Sutra, those were all preserved in Nepal, as well as a bunch of others. So when possible, of course, it's better to use the Sanskrit, because the Chinese versions were translated from Pali or Sanskrit. And yeah, you can see the Chinese translations are translations. And in some cases, in any translation, meaning gets distorted or altered. For example, the standard Chinese translation of the Diamond Sutra, in my opinion, is a little bit off, particularly on a few key passages. The Chinese translation seems to have kind of missed the point a little bit, or presented a very one-sided translation of things, which is hard to avoid in translation. It's hard to avoid giving a one-sided interpretation. Then Gita asks, Bhante, I found the Mahayana Sutras have, just to finish Michael's question. Another thing is that the Chinese language has very simple grammar, which also means that Chinese sentences tend to afford a range of different interpretations. Especially the clipped, concise style that's used in the Buddhist Chinese sutras tends to afford a great deal of poetic interpretation, which on the one hand is beautiful and lovely, but on the other hand, if somebody doesn't thoroughly know the Dhamma, they can easily get a wrong understanding of something. So that also is an impact of language on the texts. So if possible, it's always best to read in Pali or Sanskrit, because these are the oldest versions that we have. Gita says, Bhante, I found the Mahayana Sutras have several layers when I read them. What are your thoughts? Yeah, that tends to be true. Yeah. It's also true of the Theravada Sutras, though not to quite the same extent. The Theravada Sutras do tend to be much more straightforward and bare bones. Mahayana Sutras do often have multiple layers of meaning. And if one only gets the surface level of meaning, then one tends to miss what's being said. The Pure Land teachings are a great example of this. The surface level interpretation of Pure Land Buddhism actually reads as pretty shallow. But when you start to get to the deeper layers of meaning, then you realize that it's incredibly profound, and that it's not really dramatically different from any other Buddhist tradition. Elaine says, is it okay to read the suttas on Sutra Central? If so, in which order would you recommend I read them? Yeah, that's fine. It's totally fine to read the suttas on Sutra Central. Those are Bhante Sujato's translations. The order I normally recommend is for people to start with the Majjhima Nikaya, and then to read the Samyutta Nikaya and then the Anguttara Nikaya. And then after that, you can read the Digha Nikaya if you wish to, and also the short poetic collections, the Dhammapada, Udana, Suttinapata, Itivuttika, and so on. I don't recommend reading the short collections at the beginning because they're quite difficult to understand if you don't already have a good grasp of the Dhamma. The Majjhima Nikaya is a good balance. The suttas are long enough and they give enough explanation and context, but they're also short enough. So Kauser friend asks, what about Tanisro's translations? Are they okay? Similarly, Galaxy asks, can you comment on the translation by Tanisro Bhikkhu? So once again, my favorite contemporary translators in this order are me, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Bhante Sujato. Okay, that's it. So, Kauser friend says, why are the Chinese translations better? Better than what? Better than the English translations? Well, for one thing, they're much older, and they were. There's actually many different translators who worked on the Chinese canon, and it's been heavily analyzed and worked on over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. So in terms of refinement and precision of translation, yeah, there's something there about a ancient body of texts which has been the foundation of profoundly transformative Buddhist practice for almost 2,000 years. So in the case of Chinese Buddhism. So that carries a lot of significance. If the translations were substantially wrong, then Chinese Buddhism would not be successful. It would not have flourished. It would not have thrived. It would not have produced so many amazing practitioners and teachers. It would not have produced such incredible Buddhist traditions. Whereas the English-speaking Buddhist world is still quite new. So that makes it a bit more questionable. We've only had Buddhist texts in English for a little over 100 years. That's not a long time. We're hoping that we understand the Dhamma in English. And I think it's likely. But the Chinese definitely understand the Dhamma in Chinese. They've had 1,800 years of history behind it to show that they understand it. So but again, if you're going to go through the effort of learning another language, learn Pali or Sanskrit. So you can read the oldest version of the texts. Okay, that's it for the questions. So if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and end for the morning. So we'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you this evening.